I was never an outdoor person. I liked staying inside my room and hated leaving it since I always felt unsafe and anxious around everyone, family, and strangers alike. So, my parents decided to send me and my younger sister, who was 2 years behind me, on a 1-week camping trip during the wonderful month of August. I wasn't very happy about it, was an understatement. We arrived on the campground where I met my camp leaders. There were 3 in total. Ages ranged from 19 to 22. I was put in a tent with a few girls whose names I will not say for confidential reasons. Same for the camp. We set up our sleeping bags for the night, yet none of us slept. They just chatted for the entire night, while I listened. The morning came and they were all very tired, so I could tell they weren't used to staying up all night. I had a very broke sleep schedule. I slept for about 4 hours a week, so I was fine. In the morning, we did some camp activities like learning how to start a fire and how to identify plants. I even saw a couple of deer. I will skip ahead a few days since nothing happened for the next 3 days. It was nighttime. It was our second last night to spend at the camp, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't want to go home. I couldn't sleep again, so I was just using a very subtle nightlight to read. It barely illuminated the pages, since I was careful not to wake up the leaders and the girls in my tent. I then noticed how eerily quiet it was other than my slow breathing and the pages I turned. I brushed off the uneasiness of the silence and decided to enjoy it. After all, I think silence is underrated. The girl next to me woke up and groggily told me she wanted to use the bathroom. She was too scared to go alone. Who wouldn't be? The closest bathroom was at least 2 miles away, and walking those 2 miles in the woods and then back uphill would be tearing to say the least. I gave her a comforting smile, telling her I'd go with her, even though I wanted to stay in the tent in the warmth of my sleeping bag and the peacefulness of the light yellow glow of my nightlight. I twisted my ankle a day prior, and it hurt, but I had high pain tolerance, so I got out of the tent with the girl who was 4 inches taller than me. I turned on my flashlight that I grabbed with me. We walked about 100 feet into the woods so we wouldn't disturb anyone. She quickly went behind a tree and did her business while I used my flashlight to observe the darkness of the woods. An immense amount of dread hit me like a bus, and I thought I was having another panic attack. My anxiety became worse when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. I, on reflex, pointed my flashlight in that direction. "Amelia!" a familiar voice called out. My sister's voice. Wait. My sister's voice? She was 8 miles away, on the other side of the campground in a cabin. I was confused. My sister could never walk that far. In the darkness, nonetheless. She was scared of the dark, and her stamina was really low. I turned to where the voice came from and pointed my flashlight in that direction. Just out of the light's glow stood a girl, just an inch shorter than me, short brown hair and her naturally very skinny figure. The more I inspected her, the more I noticed she was skinnier than usual. My sister is already very petite. You can see her bones through her skin. But my sister in the forest, I could make out where each bone in her body was. Her joints, they looked so broken. The girl finished her business and reached for my arm, which I flinched at the contact. "It's just me," she said. Her voice held concern and emotion. It was her. "Amelia," my sister called out again. It seemed as if her voice was a recording getting played again. I kept looking at the figure until the girl behind me asked, barely above a whisper, "Who is that?" in a questioning tone. "It looks like my sister, but it can't be her," I replied in a very quiet whisper, which the girl barely heard since my voice itself was very silent. "We should go," I said sternly, but still kept it hardly above a whisper. So we did what any logical person would do. We ran. My ankle hurt so much, but I never stopped. I could hear it trying to catch up to us. It was fast, but we were faster. We got to our campus, and we immediately got inside the tent. Only then did I realize how bad my ankle actually hurt. "Ew, what's that smell?" the girl to my left said. It smelled of rot and iron, a smell I was familiar with due to living on a farm for 8 years of my life. I quickly replied with, "Probably one of the kids here took a shit near the campsite." I lied, knowing they'd believe me. Probably one of the boys who think they're too cool for this," she said with a tired eye roll. I smiled at her and told her she should get some rest as well as the rest who have woken up. They went to bed while I stayed up the rest of the night staring out the small opening of the window of our tent. It was still there, yet it no longer looked like my sister. It looked like my mother. A creepy smile made its way on my quote-unquote mother's face. We made eye contact. My mother's green eyes were replaced with a milky white. I looked away immediately. I need to make it through this and next night and I'll be okay, I thought to myself, trying my best not to have a panic attack. It was finally morning and we went through the usual day. Then, night came. I decided to try my best to fall asleep tonight, which I did. That morning we packed our things and said our goodbyes. I got in my parents' car with my sister. My mother and father greeted us with a smile, asking about the trip. "It was decent," I replied in my usual quiet, monotone voice. "I thought it was fun." My little sister smiled with joy, lacing her tone. It was her. It wasn't the creature. We got home, and I immediately took a shower, and after unpacking I went skateboarding, which I do to get my mind off things. A conclusion was made that day. I'm never going camping again. It was the first night of my spring break, and I decided to go tent camping with my dad in East Texas. I had a machete with me, and I wasn't feeling too uncomfortable. We set up camp, sat by the fire, and went to bed. Everything was pretty normal, until later. I woke up at 12:30 to hear someone's dog frantically barking at something. This just pegged me as really annoying, as we were trying to sleep. I also had one of the worst headaches I think I've ever had. A few minutes later, I realized the forest was silent except for the dog. I am certainly not an avid camper, as I have only camped twice before that, but even I was smart enough to know that it means there is a predator around. Now I was fully on edge, and as I was trying to fall back asleep, I heard something which sounded like a cross between a mountain lion, a woman, and a horse shrieking. While it was repeating this, my dad sat up and then passed out again. No wonder. I told him he shouldn't have had 4 beers. This continued on for about 20 seconds before it shut up. I know this was not a mountain lion because I heard a few on my previous camping trip. This sounded more unnatural than that. I tried to go back to sleep and was successful. I woke up again at 3:15 to hear a rooster crowing. Again, this was deeply annoying, and my head was pounding even worse now. While I was trying to fall asleep again, there was another weird sound. At first I was sure it was a donkey braying, but then the voice got really deep and sounded like a smoker gasping for breath. I was just so confused and in so much pain that I couldn't think clearly. I stumbled out of the tent to relieve myself and find some of the Advil I packed, which was not a smart move. It was drizzling this weird sort of thick rain that smelled metallic. This was weird because the moon was peeking out from the clouds right now. As I was peeing on a tree, I heard rustling in the bushes from the direction I heard the demented donkey. I turned to look and noticed there was something like rotten, raw deer meat on the ground. It was nearly a full moon, so it was very bright. Then it stumbled out of the bushes. I was looking at something I thought was a man. It had pale gray skin with sunken eyes and no nose. It was limping along and didn't seem to notice me. This was definitely not a man. I just stood there, hoping it would continue to ignore me. It bent like all the way to the ground and started just eating the meat. Once it was finished, it turned back the way it came and limped back through the tree line. Honestly, I wasn't even that scared. I was just in shock. I was thinking, zombies don't exist. What on earth? But I really don't think it was a zombie. I have zero idea of what this thing was. They say that kids are more prone to the supernatural realm. I'm not sure if I truly believe that. However, this is a true story about recurring nightmares I had as a child. I would always have these bizarre dreams where something demonic would talk to me through flames in my attic or a deep darkness within my home. It was always the same evil, malicious voice, threatening me, my family, or speaking in a language I didn't understand. This particular nightmare I'm about to share has stuck with me throughout my entire life. Get comfortable, because it is a bit long. I was outside my house at night, which was unusual since I lived by the rule: when the street lights come on, it's time to come in, or you will be grounded. I could see inside my house through the window. The lights were on and my family was sitting down for dinner. I watched them, confused as to why they didn't seem to notice or care about my absence. I started banging on the window to get their attention, to no avail. My friends at the time all lived a house or two away from my own. Suddenly there was a swing set in the driveway. My best friend Kyle was swinging on it. I felt instantaneous relief because I was no longer alone, but I also knew that something wasn't right. I went over to him and sat on the swing set. He wasn't talking, nor did he even seem to notice my presence beside him. I kept trying to get his attention when I remembered the candy I had stashed in my backyard. Surely that would pull him out of his strange trance, I thought. I told him to please wait for me to go grab a surprise I'd saved for us. After getting no response, I ran to the place I really did have Starburst hidden from my parents. I grabbed it and started running back, hoping he didn't leave me out there alone. I stopped abruptly to see a vacant swing, still swaying back and forth. I was frozen with fear. He was gone. All the houses looked dark and locked up tight. I was facing the street as I watched in horror. Each set of streetlights went black, one set at a time, coming toward me, that familiar darkness which I already knew held something evil within it. I ran back to my front door, repeatedly ringing the doorbell to my house as I watched the darkness closing in. I knew this would be the time it finally consumed me. I felt tricked and terrified. There was nothing I could do as it was coming right for me. The last thing I remember is closing my eyes before the last of the lights went black, accompanied by the sound of demonic laughter. Maybe it did find its way in that day. I never had another nightmare like it. Ever since then, I've always been drawn to dark things and occasionally get blindsided with debilitating depression. I know this was a dream, but that doesn't make it any less real or true. I'd love to hear or read some other stories like mine. What's your worst nightmare? Me and my girlfriend got out of high school on the last day of 9th grade, and we decided to go camping to celebrate. Of course, we were not going to drink because I'm not much of a drinker, so we packed the car and my friend asked if he could come, and I told him it was okay. We got to the campsite and set up tents, and the sun was about to set, and I told them I was going to get campfire wood and took off to get firewood, and I went about 1 mile out, and then I started to get the feeling that I was being watched. I looked around to see if I truly alone nobody was around, and then I stopped and saw bunches of wood and picked up some wood, and that's when I saw a tree house in a tree that was about 30 feet from me. So I climbed up the ladder, and that's when the ladder fell. "Oh shit!" I yelled, and then I went dead still when I heard walking. At the time I carried around a revolver, and I grabbed it out of my holster and held it in my hand, and that thing was at the trunk of the tree. I had the edging idea to look over the wood, and what I saw scared me for life. A tall, dead-looking deer with glowing white eyes staring up at the treehouse. It was about 10 p.m. and I don't know what it was at the time, but at this point in time I realized that it was a Wendigo. But I still can't forget what it told me. It sounded like my sister for about 4 minutes, telling me, "Let me up, bro." But my sister never called me bro. Then after that I mimicked my girlfriend Brooklyn. It kept going for about an hour. And then I looked again to see if that thing was still there, and it was staring right at me. I shot at the thing, and it let out a devilish scream and ran off towards the distant trees. Then I fell back and fell asleep. And then I woke up in a watch tour, and my friend and her girlfriend and my girlfriend was looking down at me, and she kisses me, and I say, "Where is that thing? Where is that dead deer?" To this day I never saw the thing again, but to this day it haunts me for life. My wife drowned our son in the bathtub. Now I know why I remember coming into the house on one cold winter's night. The snow and icy wind blew through the front door as I stepped into the house, kicking my boots clean. I noticed a strange odor in the place. It almost smelled like stink bugs with notes of copper and bleach. I hated the smell of stink bugs. "Hey, honey," I said. "Where are you? I'm starving, and by the way, it smells weird in here." Traffic nearly stopped for a half hour on I-80. A goddamn tractor trailer flipped over in the middle of the blizzard and closed down all 3 lanes. We could only get around by driving in the breakdown lane until cops got there and started. My voice trailed away as I noticed the drops of blood on the floor leading from the front hallway into the kitchen. I stopped talking immediately, looking around for signs of an intruder. I saw nothing. No smashed windows, no busted doors, no rifled through drawers or cabinets. "Oh my God," I whispered, immediately going to the kitchen and grabbing the largest meat cleaver I could find from the knife block. Its edges gleamed, freshly sharpened and ready to slice into the hardest of flesh. I made sure not to step on the drops of blood. I didn't want to disturb a crime scene, if indeed it was a crime scene. I stopped, thinking of calling 911, but some inner voice urged me on. "It will take 5 or 6 minutes for the police to arrive, possibly longer," it said, "and you need to check on your family now, right now." Sprinting forwards, I followed the blood trail down the hall and straight to the first-floor bathroom. The door stood closed. I tried the handle and found it locked. "Hello?" I said, pounding on the door. "Who's in there? Open up." "Isaac, is that you?" a faint voice asked. I recognized the voice of my wife immediately. "Open the goddamn door," I screamed. Rising waves of anxiety and adrenaline coursed through my body, and I immediately knew something was very wrong. I could hear it in the dead tone of my wife's voice, see it glistening on the floor in crimson droplets, feel it in the air like falling pressure before a thunderstorm. "Jenna, open the door." I heard some slight shuffling in the small bathroom, like someone dragging themselves across the floor. Then I heard a click. I opened the door and found a chamber of nightmares lying beyond the threshold. My only son floated face down in the bathtub. My wife sat back down on the edge of the tub, rocking back and forth, her eyes flat and dead. "Why?" I whispered, horrified. "Why would you do this?" "Don't you know?" she murmured in a croaking voice. "Do you really not know that our son is the Antichrist?" Maybe I did have suspicions that something wasn't quite right with Max. It was more than the dead animals I kept finding strewn around the yard and under the house. It was more than the way his eyes seemed to shine in the dark when I wished him good night. No, it was a feeling, a cold, empty feeling that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He had no friends at school, and animals avoided him like the plague. Dogs would start barking and howling when he walked down the street, and cats would hiss, then disappear with a swish of their tail in a flash, behind bushes or up trees. These things, on their own, wouldn't be too much evidence of anything, but they were far from the only evidence that Max was unusual. A month ago, a couple boys had tried to bully Max at school. They ran out of the bathroom where it happened, crying and wetting their pants as blood streamed from their noses and ears. They wouldn't tell anyone what happened, and Max just kept smiling and staring at them with his large, dark eyes. The school called an ambulance, and the doctors were baffled. They had to sit in the emergency room for 3 hours before the blood stopped pouring out of their bodies. They were white as sheets by the time it finally clotted, and the doctors had no idea of the cause. The 2 boys went missing a few days later. The case ended up drawing media attention. The FBI came in, but they found absolutely nothing. It seemed like the boys just disappeared out their windows, and then their trail immediately went cold. Tracking dogs couldn't find any hint of a trail. It was as if they had teleported from their bedrooms. Moreover, no neighbors had seen a thing. A couple months later, a few hikers found the boys' fingers growing out of a tree on the Appalachian Trail, over 50 miles away. The FBI swooped in and used DNA testing to determine that these fingers belonged to the missing boys from Max's school. No one ever explained how the rotting fingers had become quite literally fused into the tree, however. No one ever tried to bully Max again after that. In fact, the other kids gave him as much distance as possible. I tried to watch Max when he didn't know I was looking. He was only an 8-year-old boy, but he could put on masks like a psychopath and charm nearly anyone he met. As soon as they turned away, though, he would scowl and narrow his eyes, as if he wanted to stab them in the back. But this was my son, after all. I loved him, and I think he loved me in his own strange way. Even my wife said she loved him, and she claims that's why she had to kill him. A strange kind of love, I admit. But I don't think she's lying. I think she did love him, and she feared what would happen when his ascension had finished, and he sat on a throne of bones, crushing out the lives of millions of people with an iron heart. She feared the consequences for him, she said. Only for him, and she loved him, and so she had to kill him and stop it now before it grew into a grinding juggernaut that devoured his soul and sent him to hell. "Are you my true father?" Max had asked me that morning as I sat at the kitchen table. I put down my coffee cup slowly with shaking hands, then turned to look at my son. "Yes, of course," I said with a trembling voice. "Why would you ask such a crazy question?" He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes so dark they looked black. They blazed with an inner light. His pale white skin looked as smooth as a statue's, and dark hair fell over his chiseled features. If it weren't for his aloofness and cruelty, he would have been a very beautiful boy. Instead, he radiated a coldness like the moon, an aura that gave light but no heat, a kind of reptilian psychopath detachment that extended to everything he did. He would laugh when he saw fatal car accidents on the highway, or heard the news report about wars and murders. "I don't think you are my true father," Max said, still staring at me, reading me like a book. I felt myself begin to sweat. "Max, that's ridiculous," I said. "Your mother and I have been married." "Then where does my power come from?" he asked. "Why do I possess what you never will?" "I know I'm related to Mother." He spat out the word as if it were a filthy thing. "Mother, but you, I know not. I know not where my divinity comes from. You seem weak and foolish to me. At least Mother has the courage to admit that she hates me. You grovel and pretend, and then, when my back is turned, you sneer at me and my ascension. I know you do. You are a last man like so many others. Your kind is ineradicable as fleas, hopping all over the world without meaning or the will to power. You don't understand someone like me. You could never understand someone like me. Not in a million years." "I don't understand what all this business about ascension is," I said. "I think you're living in a fantasy world." "If it were a fantasy world," he said, "then the fruit would not be revealed. But it will be. Soon everyone will see, including you. I'll be with my true father and become the absolute king of this world. Small men like you will grovel like worms. They'll be crushed under my feet as I rise to heights previously undreamed of as part of my becoming. My greatness will shine like a second sun. People will remember my name with awe and terror for 1,000 years." He spoke like a much older boy. I gawked at him with an open mouth. He had a faraway look in his eyes, a fanatical gleam that sharpened his cold features. I remembered when Max was just a little boy. Did I know it back then, when I watched him playing with his toys? Did I know what he was? I think I would have run screaming from the room if I had. Max turned and left the room, grabbing his backpack as the school bus pulled up in front of the house. I watched him go. He walked with the confidence and straight back of a soldier, and yet, I thought I saw an aura of swirling black shadows around him. I blinked, and like mist under the hot summer sun, I saw it dissolve into the air. I looked away, sweating and shaking. With trembling hands, I tried to pick up the coffee cup. It immediately fell to the floor in my nervous fingers and shattered. 50 minutes later, I was working from home when the first of the ambulances and police cars raced by, heading to Max's school. My neighbor, a teacher at the school who the kids called Mr. Hallen, told me the story from his viewpoint later that day. I don't know how much I believed. At the time, maybe none of it. Now, all of it. The day started normally enough, Mr. Hallen said, pushing his oversized glasses up on his long, nerdy face. The kids started streaming in for homeroom. Then the bell rang. I started preparing my lecture notes for first period. That was when the screaming started from down the hallway. It sounded like a girl being murdered. Just an endless, pained shrieking that went on and on and on. Abruptly, it cut off, and everything went deathly silent. The students all looked at each other, nervous. A hissing voice came over the intercom, a reptilian voice that made my skin crawl. It started talking, and I immediately knew it wasn't human. And yet, it sounded just like Max. I mean, he's been in my class for years. Isn't that weird? It was like someone had taken his voice and ran it through a synthesizer to deepen it and slow it down. I heard weird hissing breaths as he spoke. "Hello, friends," the voice whispered, yet the words boomed through every classroom and hallway. "We have a very special day planned for you. The activities are already prepared, and the festivities will now begin. Don't try to escape now. That breaks the rules. The first of the sheep have already been slaughtered. Good luck." I figured some hoodlum had snuck into the office and somehow used the intercom while the secretary was out getting a cup of coffee or using the bathroom. I put my hands up as the class began to chatter, trying to calm them down. Kids, I said, "it's clearly just a prank. Please calm down." Then the classroom door flew open, and a girl came running inside. She was covered in blood from head to toe. She had deep slices across the back of her head, her forehead, her right cheek, and right arm. Large, fetid drops of blood fell behind her as she ran, as if leaving breadcrumbs to find her way back. The wounds on her body changed colors in front of our eyes, turning purple and then black. Necrotic tissue began to spread and die within moments. Black blood streamed from the wounds. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, but only a choked gasping came out. Something had infested the girl, I could see it. I quickly backed away, feeling like it was a dream. "Please, oh God, please help," she whispered, whimpering, her legs buckling. She fell to her knees. The kids in the classroom began to scream, "Please, someone, help me!" Her voice grew louder, her skin paler as the purplish, dying patches of tissue spread. She opened her mouth and began to vomit some foul, oily sludge. "It hurts, she moaned, falling into the puddle of vomit. "Isn't someone going to help me?" I ran to her side. I didn't know this girl. She wasn't in any of my classes, you see, but I knew she needed medical attention immediately. "What happened?" I asked. "Who did this?" She got close to my ear and whispered. "There's things in the hallways that shouldn't exist," she said, still whimpering. She coughed up more blood and black fluid, rolling onto her back afterwards and breathing hard. Her eyelids fluttered and her skin went pale. I thought she was losing consciousness until her eyes rolled back in her head and she sat up, grinning. Claws began to rip out of her fingers. Black tears streamed down her face, and that dark sludge dripped from her mouth like diseased drops of saliva. Her body lengthened, and her arms and legs broke and twisted. I could hear the bones snapping like tree branches during a winter storm. I watched the transformation in horror, backing away. The other kids were all screaming and streaming to the back of the classroom. The girl hissed as black veins appeared all around her face and neck. She rose and walked towards the scared kids in the back, her movements as smooth as a synchronized dancer's, jerky and twisted, nightmarish in their own way. But what came next was far worse. Her body grew taller, thinner, and more emaciated as it stretched up to the ceiling, towering over every other kid in the class. She must have grown to at least 7 feet by that point. Her arms reached out, the bone-white claws sharpening as she struck out at the screaming row of children in front. I saw drops of blood splash against the back wall, and a couple boys stumbled forwards, their throats slashed wide open. Their panic-stricken faces grew pale and bloodless as they choked and tried to scream, but only bubbling gasps came out. I saw the window was open and I was on the first floor. I decided to run, to try to get help. I knew we needed policemen and medics at the scene, and I couldn't do anything to save the kids. Well, to be honest, I feel like shit about it. But I did run. As the screams followed me from the back of the classroom, I jumped right out the window and ran across the playground and scaled the fence. But as I went, I heard a strange, shrill laughter coming from the intercom. And you know what? I'm positive the voice sounded just like Max. Max came home early from school that day, grinning and laughing. He was in a fine mood. I don't know what happened after the teacher left, or how many people died in that building of horrors. But I know Max caused it all, the first prodding steps in the path of his ascension, the foundational layer to his throne of bones. Mr. Hallen had talked to Jenna early that morning, immediately after running home from that den of nightmares, and she had already put a plan into motion. When Max got home from school, she gave him a Gatorade with a large amount of fentanyl she had purchased from a random drug dealer in the inner city dissolved inside. She added some more sugar to mask any slight bitterness, and gave it to the grinning boy with large black pupils like smoldering coals. He drank it quickly, looking at her the whole time with his dilated eyes. He smiled and got up, but soon afterwards collapsed. Jenna found him unconscious in his bedroom and dragged him to the bathroom. She filled the tub and held Max underwater until the bubbles stopped. As my wife explained it all to me, a sense of loss and horror came over me. I didn't know if I missed Max or not. His swollen blue face showed without a doubt that he was dead. I took my wife outside and sat her down at the table, debating whether I should call the police. No one had ever told me what to do in this situation, and I felt like I was flying blind. I got up pacing. I went to the oven and started brewing some instant coffee. Soft footsteps rustled behind me. I turned around to see Max, seemingly alive and well, but also changed in some fundamentally disturbing way. His eyes had now turned fully black. He hovered inches above the ground behind my wife, smiling at me, his teeth seeming much sharper and longer than before. A feeling of electricity sizzled in the air. I could see some sort of expansive black aura rippling around his pale skin, dark and cold as empty space. Goosebumps rose on my body just from being near that sickly aura. The water pot began to boil behind me. Behind Max, I saw the strange, mutated children from the school creep out of the front hallway. 4 or 5 of them skittered about with emaciated, twisted legs, bending in ways no human leg should bend. Their heads nearly scraped the low kitchen ceiling. Their pale, broken arms reached down to their knees, jointed in myriad areas. I could hear the soft cracking of bones now as they slowly moved forwards, a light snapping sound like small twigs broken underfoot. Their blank white eyes constantly dribbled ebony tears that stained their bleached, bloodless skin. "Mother, mother," Max said condescendingly, sounding like a disappointed parent. "You should have known that you cannot kill me except by decapitation or by burning my body. Do you think my true father would let a worthless louse like yourself kill me before my ascension to the throne? Are you that foolish and blind?" Jenna began to cry, refusing to look at her son. "But I respect your courage in action. For that I will give you a quick death." He looked straight at me. "Which is something you will not receive, my fake father. You are a weak, worthless coward, and you deserve to die slowly, screaming yourself hoarse and pleading for release. For so do the screams of the weak sound as a beautiful symphony to the ears of my true father and myself. The deaths of the weak will pave the road to a new world." He motioned to the mutated children behind them. Their bodies had become so twisted and contorted that I couldn't tell whether they had been boys or girls. They looked only like monsters now, like walking corpses. In a blur, one of them ran forward and grabbed my wife's head. A scream bubbled in my throat as I watched, but it was over before I even knew what was happening. The thing used its crooked, clawed fingers to twist her head, snapping her neck in a second. Jenna's face was now looking straight behind her, the skin on her neck spiraling around in sickly folds. On her broken flesh, I saw burst blood vessels and rapidly spreading purple bruises. She gave a death gasp, releasing an endless, choking breath, her eyelids fluttering and fingers twitching. Then she was still. Max gave a slow, deep laugh, a grating sound that seemed to rise up from the depths of his withered soul. His black eyes flashed with amusement and pleasure. Max grinned, his vampiric teeth shining and white, reflecting the cold winter sunlight streaming in from the window. The water pot began to whistle as increasing torrents of steam poured out of it. Without hesitation, I spun and grabbed it, flicking open the spout by pressing the button on the handle. Then I flung it at Max, the boiling hot water flying out in a spiraling stream as the metal water pot circled through the air. It all seemed to happen as if in slow motion. I saw Max's look of triumph and amusement morph into a scowl of hatred and anger, but the motion had been so quick and accurate that he couldn't have moved in time. The heavy metal pot smacked him in the face, spilling scalding hot water all over his face and neck. He screamed and fell back, knocking over the mutated bodies of the children he had turned into his mindless followers. I sprinted towards the door without looking back, heading outside. The constant stream of police and ambulance sirens heading to the school had stopped. Now dozens of black SUVs streamed into town. Men in dark suits with mirrored sunglasses stepped out. I looked back to the house and saw a few of the new arrivals running in with automatic rifles. Others headed to neighbors' houses, breaking down doors and entering without knocking. I heard rifles firing and hoarse, gurgling screams. The mutated children ran out of my house, their bodies riddled with bullets. They slowly lost energy as black blood streamed out of multiple giant exit wounds eaten into their bodies. They eventually fell down on the streets and died with a last rasping breath. But they never found Max. They quarantined the town and went from house to house and building to building, searching for the source of all this death and evil. But he had somehow escaped. They killed all the mutated fanatics they could find, but the bodies of many children from the school seemed unaccounted for. I knew where they had gone. They had followed Max, fanatical soldiers for his new army, fearless of death and committed to their leader and his new world order. I don't know where Max went or where he'll show up next, but I know he is moving towards his ascension, and the next time I see him, he will arrive in power and glory and crush out the lives of millions of people under his feet. To start off this story, I live in Alaska, and this story took place when I was about 10. I'm F15. So on to the story. During the summer, I always went camping. When I went camping, I went with my old best friend and her family. I'll call her Anna for privacy. But during this summer, her father decided we'd go to like the middle of nowhere and camp. I was not up for it, but I didn't want to be at home, so we went to camp for the week. Everyone who went on the trip was my friend Anna, her father, her two brothers, her brother's girlfriend. Once we got to the camp, I was scared to get out because I saw a sign that said, "Be aware of bears." And being little, I thought I'd get attacked if I was ever alone. Also, we left really early in the morning and didn't get to the camp until 2 p.m. I was really tired and sore from being in the car so long and eventually got out of the car to help. The camp we went to was surrounded in woods and had a little pit for a fire and was good for our tent. Later on, we finally got settled, and Anna wanted to go fishing. We saw a lake and a stream. We grabbed our fishing poles and tried to leave on our own when we were stopped and were told to go with her brothers and the girlfriend. We had to make our own path, and her older brother had a machete to cut a path, so we finally got to the stream after like 5 minutes of walking and had a lot of fun. Then out of nowhere, we all got like a chill down our backs and got spooked, and I started saying I wanted to go back to camp, and then Dan, the oldest, said to stop whining, and if I wanted to go back, I had to go on my own. And Anna said she'd go back with me, and so we left and went down the path that we thought we made, and in reality we didn't, and didn't realize it wasn't our path until we got to a dead end and were surrounded by raspberry bushes, then started freaking out. And out of nowhere we heard something walking through the woods going towards us. And I said it could be a bear. Then we started freaking out more because we couldn't see anything. Then I noticed the smoke from a fire not too far but not close. It was past the bushes. That's when I dropped my pole and grabbed my friend Anna, and we ran through the bushes and Devil's Club, a stick-like plant with big leaves and spikes. I didn't even notice how much it hurt from adrenaline and the fear of getting caught by whatever was following us. When we finally got through the bushes, we were a bloody mess. Our legs were covered in blood and dirt, and our clothes were torn, and we ended up in a different campsite next ours. And the people stared at us confused. I looked back at the woods to see a huge black figure go back into the woods. I was relieved to see it go, and collapsed to the ground, and that's when the couple helped us up and brought us to our camp. And when her family saw us, they all freaked out and asked us where we went. And for the next hour or two, we explained what happened, and they told us we were gone more than an hour, and they tried looking for us. And for the rest of the trip, my friend and I slept in the truck. Ever since this incident, I've never gone camping in that area, and camp where lots of people are, and today I still don't know what was in the woods and what it intended to do if it got us, and I'm glad it didn't. And to this day we still talk about this incident. The anticipation was palpable as I finalized the purchase of my new hunting property deep in the rugged Texas wilderness. The land was untamed, teeming with game, and a thrill for any hunter like me. Little did I know that this new acquisition would lead to a horrifying encounter that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I quickly set up trail cameras throughout the dense forest, eager to get a sense of the wildlife on my new land. The first few weeks were uneventful, capturing images of deer, raccoons, and the occasional bear. But one crisp autumn morning, as I checked the latest trail camera photos, my excitement turned to unease. There, amidst the ordinary animal captures, was a picture that sent chills down my spine. It was a dark, massive figure, covered in fur, with a human-like face, staring with its gray, dead eyes directly into the camera. It was unmistakable, a Sasquatch, the legendary creature that had been whispered about in hushed tones by hunters and locals for generations. My heart pounded as I examined the photo over and over. Surely it was some weirdo in a costume, perhaps an inbred black bear. I kept making excuses as to what it was in order to comfort myself. I knew the consequences of sharing this with anyone. I'd be ridiculed, deemed a madman. Obviously no one would believe me. So naturally the need to prove what I had seen gnawed at me. Determined to find answers, I decided to venture into the woods with my loyal hunting dog Max by my side. The day was overcast, the forest eerily silent as Max and I hiked deeper into the woods. The anticipation weighed heavily on me. As excited as I may have been, I was terrified. Deep down, though, I figured I probably wouldn't even encounter it. Hours passed and the sun began its descent. Just as I had given up hope, we heard it. A low, guttural growl, resonating through the trees. My hand instinctively went to the rifle slung over my shoulder. I signaled for Max to stay close, but the faithful dog growled, his hackles raised. Suddenly, it emerged from the shadows, that familiar massive dark figure, covered in matted black fur, with piercing eyes that held a deep, primal intelligence. It was said Sasquatch, and it had found us. Fear gripped me hard, and my heart raced as I raised my rifle, not intending to harm the creature, but only to ward it off. The Sasquatch, with a speed that defied its size, lunged forward, its massive arms closing around Max. My loyal dog let out a heart-wrenching yelp as the creature's grip tightened. I fired my rifle, but missed completely as the beast flew about the thick woods, carrying my buddy Max in its filthy grip. The world seemed to slow down, and I watched in abject horror as Max was being torn apart by the monstrous beast. The Sasquatch's eyes bore into mine, an intelligence in them that sent a shiver down my spine. With Max's lifeless body cradled in its arms, the Sasquatch turned and vanished back into the forest, leaving behind a shaken and anguished hunter. I was left in the darkening woods, the weight of guilt and grief pressing down on me. I wanted to cry, but yet I was emotionless. I'd sought proof, but the cost was higher than I could have ever imagined. As I made my way back to my cabin, the forest's once familiar beauty now held a sinister aura. The Sasquatch was no longer a legend. It was a brutal reality that had torn my world apart, and I would forever be haunted by the memory of that fateful encounter. The chilling scream of the Sasquatch echoed in my ears, a reminder that the line between myth and reality had blurred, and the forest held secrets more terrifying than I had ever imagined. The summer of 2008 was etched in my memory, a time when the world seemed both vast and intimate. I was just a child then, wide-eyed and curious, with Europe as my playground. Our family, consisting of my parents and me, along with our 2 loyal canine companions, had always been adventurers at heart. Every summer we'd pack our car to the brim with essentials and set off on journeys that would become the stories of our lives. That particular year, our compass pointed towards Luxembourg, a gem nestled in the heart of Western Europe. It was a country I'd only seen in atlases, its borders embraced by Belgium, Germany, and France. As we crossed into Luxembourg, I pressed my face against the car window, marveling at how the landscape transformed. Gone were the flat expanses I was accustomed to. In their place rose a terrain of undulating hills and mysterious forests. My father, a man with salt and pepper hair and a penchant for spontaneity, was at the wheel. His eyes sparkled with excitement as he navigated the winding roads. "You see, son," he'd say, his voice carrying over the hum of the engine, "Luxembourg may be small, but it's got a big heart. And mountains. Did you know that?" I shook my head, absorbing this new information like a sponge. My mother, seated beside him, would chime in with fascinating tidbits from the guidebook spread across her lap. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight filtering through the trees, creating a halo effect that made her look almost magical. As we drove deeper into the country, the mountains began to make their presence known. They weren't the towering giants of the Alps, but rather proud, ancient guardians of the land. Their slopes were cloaked in dense forests, occasionally parting to reveal charming villages or solitary castles perched on rocky outcrops. Our dogs, Max and Luna, a pair of energetic golden retrievers, whined softly from the back seat, eager for their next adventure. I patted their heads, sharing in their anticipation. The car was filled with the scent of the picnic my mother had packed, fresh bread, local cheeses, and the promise of sweet pastries for dessert. As the day wore on, the familiar gave way to the unknown. We had long since left the main roads, following smaller paths that snaked through the countryside. The paved surfaces gradually turned to gravel, then to dirt tracks barely wide enough for our vehicle. "Let's explore here," my father suddenly announced, pulling the car to a stop at a seemingly random spot along the road. It was a decision that would change everything. We stepped out of the car, stretching our legs after hours of driving. The air was different here, crisp and laden with the scent of pine and wild herbs. Max and Luna bounded out, their tails wagging furiously as they investigated this new territory. Across the road from where we had parked loomed an imposing sight. It was a wall of rock, smooth and formidable, rising at least as high as a 2-story house. The top was crowned with trees, their roots somehow finding purchase in the seemingly impenetrable stone. But what caught my eye was a huge crack that ran down the middle of this natural fortress, splitting it in two. "Look there," my mother pointed, her keen eyes spotting a detail I had missed. At the base of the crack, barely visible, was a crude stairway carved into the rock. It led upwards, disappearing into the shadows between the two halves of the mountain. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the warmth of the summer day. I had always been sensitive to the unseen, a trait that had led to several unsettling encounters in the past. Ghosts, spirits, or whatever you might call them. I had felt their presence before. Each time it left me with an uneasy feeling, a creeping sensation that I was unwelcome, an intruder in spaces not meant for the living. As we approached the base of the rock face, that familiar feeling began to stir in the pit of my stomach. Yet, curiosity overrode my apprehension. My father, ever the explorer, was already examining the rock stairway, testing its stability with his foot. It seemed solid enough, he declared, his voice echoing slightly in the confines of the crack. "Shall we see where it leads?" My mother nodded enthusiastically, already reaching for her camera. She had a passion for photography, always seeking to capture the essence of our travels. The dogs, sensing adventure, barked in agreement. With a deep breath, I followed my parents into the crack. The temperature dropped noticeably as we entered the shadow of the mountain. The walls on either side were close enough that I could touch both simultaneously if I stretched out my arms. Water trickled down in places, creating dark streaks on the rock face. As we ascended the crude steps, the feeling of unease grew stronger. It was as if unseen eyes were watching our every move, judging our intrusion. I wanted to tell my parents, to ask if we could turn back, but the words stuck in my throat. And then, about halfway up the stairs, I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a ray of sunshine somehow finding its way through the crack above. But as I blinked and focused, the image before me solidified into something both beautiful and terrifying. She stood on one of the higher steps, her form translucent yet radiant. It was as if she was made of pure light, with a soft orange glow emanating from her core. Her features were indistinct, but I could make out the curve of a smile and the gentle wave of a hand, beckoning us forward. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Do you see her?" My mother, who had been a few steps ahead, turned back. Her eyes widened as they fell upon the apparition. Without a word, she raised her camera and snapped a picture. The flash illuminated the narrow space for a split second, and in that moment, the ghostly figure seemed to shimmer and become even more defined. My father, who had been leading our ascent, hadn't noticed our pause. "Come on, you two," he called back, his voice echoing off the rock walls. "We're almost at the top." The ghost, for I was certain now that's what she was, continued to smile and wave. Despite every instinct telling me to turn and run, I found myself drawn towards her. It was as if she was pulling me forward with an invisible thread. Step by step I approached. The air around her was different, warmer, almost comforting. As I drew level with her, I could feel the heat radiating from her form, as tangible as the body heat of another person. It enveloped me, and for a moment, all my fear melted away. Then, in an instant, I passed through her. The warmth vanished, replaced by a chill that seeped into my bones. I gasped, spinning around, but the apparition had vanished. "Did you see that?" I asked my mother, my voice a mix of awe and fear. She nodded slowly, her face pale. I think I got it on camera," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We hurried to catch up with my father, who had reached the top of the stairs. As we emerged from the crack, we found ourselves on a small plateau, surrounded by dense forest. The trees here were old, their gnarled branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. My father, oblivious to what had just transpired, was already exploring the area. "There's another path here," he called out, pointing to a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods. My mother, still shaken by our encounter, suggested we take a break. We sat on some fallen logs, the dogs settling at our feet. As my parents unpacked our picnic, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we ate our lunch, the forest around us seemed to come alive. Birds called to each other in the canopy above, their songs intertwining in a complex melody. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the scent of wild mushrooms and damp earth. I tried to focus on my sandwich, but my mind kept replaying the encounter with the ghostly woman. Had she been trying to tell us something? Warn us? Or was she simply a remnant of a long-forgotten past, doomed to replay her final moments for eternity? My mother, sensing my unease, placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" she asked, her eyes filled with concern. I nodded, not trusting my voice. How could I explain the mixture of fear and fascination I felt? How could I put into words the warmth of the ghost's embrace, or the chill that followed? As if in response to my thoughts, a sudden gust of wind swept through our little clearing. It was unnaturally cold for a summer day, carrying with it whispers that seemed just on the edge of comprehension. Max and Luna whined, pressing closer to us. My father, ever the pragmatist, attributed it to the peculiar geography of the area. "Mountain weather," he said with a shrug. "It can change in an instant." But I knew better. This was no ordinary wind. It carried with it the weight of history, of lives lived and lost on this ancient mountain. As we finished our meal and packed away the remnants, my father's adventurous spirit reasserted itself. "Shall we explore that other path?" he suggested, pointing to the trail he had spotted earlier. My mother hesitated, glancing at me. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to unravel the mysteries of this place warring with her maternal instinct to protect me from the unknown. In the end, curiosity won out. We set off down the narrow trail, the dogs leading the way, their noses to the ground as they investigated every new scent. The path wound its way through the dense forest, occasionally offering glimpses of the valley below through gaps in the trees. As we walked, the whispers I had heard earlier seemed to grow stronger. They were coming from all around us now, a cacophony of voices just below the threshold of understanding. Suddenly, Max and Luna stopped in their tracks, their ears perked and tails rigid. A low growl rumbled in Max's throat. "What is it, boy?" my father asked, peering into the gloom ahead. As if in answer, the whispers coalesced into a single, clear voice. "Turn back," it said, the words carried on the wind. "This place is not for the living." My mother's face paled at the ethereal warning, her hand instinctively reaching for mine. My father, however, seemed more intrigued than frightened. His eyes scanned the forest around us, searching for the source of the voice. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rustling of leaves. My mother nodded slowly, her grip on my hand tightening. "Maybe we should head back," she suggested, her voice trembling slightly. But my father was already moving forward, his curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "It's probably just the wind playing tricks on us," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Come on, let's see where this path leads." Reluctantly, we followed him deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, obscuring what little sunlight managed to penetrate the canopy. The air grew colder with each step, and a fine mist began to swirl around our feet. The dogs whined softly, staying close to our heels rather than ranging ahead as they usually did. Their unease only added to the growing sense of dread that had settled in the pit of my stomach. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the path opened up into a small clearing. What we saw there made us all stop in our tracks. "Oh my God," my mother breathed, her free hand flying to her mouth in shock. Before us lay a forgotten graveyard, its weathered tombstones tilting at odd angles, half swallowed by the encroaching forest. Moss and lichen covered most of the stones, obscuring the names and dates carved into them. In the center of the clearing stood a crumbling mausoleum, its once grand facade now a shadow of its former glory. My father approached one of the nearest graves, brushing away the moss to reveal the inscription beneath. "These dates, some of these are hundreds of years old," he said, his voice filled with wonder. As he spoke, the mist seemed to thicken, swirling around the graves in an almost purposeful manner. The whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath our feet. "We shouldn't be here," I said, tugging on my mother's hand. "We need to leave." But even as the words left my mouth, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing in the doorway of the mausoleum was the glowing figure we had encountered earlier. Her orange light seemed dimmer now, tinged with sadness. She raised a translucent hand, beckoning us forward. My father, following my gaze, saw her too. "Incredible," he murmured, already taking a step towards the mausoleum. "No!" I cried out, but it was too late. As soon as my father's foot touched the threshold of the mausoleum, the world around us seemed to shift. The mist thickened instantly, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The whispers grew to a deafening roar, and I felt as if I was being pulled in 1,000 different directions at once. I clung to my mother's hand, terrified of being separated in this supernatural maelstrom. When the mist finally cleared, the world around us had changed. Gone was the decrepit graveyard, replaced by a bustling village square. The mausoleum had transformed into a grand church, its spire reaching towards a sky that was no longer obscured by trees. People in old-fashioned clothing hurried about their business, paying us no mind. What happened?" my mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are we?" My father, his face a mask of awe and confusion, shook his head. "Not where," he said slowly. "When? I think we've somehow traveled back in time." As impossible as it seemed, I knew he was right. The sights, sounds, and even smells around us were from a different era entirely. The dogs, still by our side, whined in confusion, pressing close to our legs. Before we could fully process what had happened, a commotion near the church caught our attention. A group of villagers had gathered, their voices raised in anger. At the center of the crowd stood a young woman, her clothes tattered and her face streaked with tears. "Witch!" one of the villagers cried out, pointing an accusing finger at the woman. "She's brought nothing but misfortune to our village." With a start, I realized that the accused woman was a younger version of the ghostly figure we had encountered. Her eyes, filled with fear and desperation, scanned the crowd, finally landing on us. For a moment, our gazes locked, and I felt a jolt of recognition pass between us. "Please!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly despite the angry shouts around her. "I'm not a witch! I only wanted to help!" But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The crowd surged forward, rough hands grabbing at her clothes and hair. My father made a move as if to intervene, but my mother held him back. "We can't," she hissed. "We don't know what consequences our actions might have." Forced to watch helplessly, we saw the woman dragged towards a pyre that had been hastily assembled near the church. As the flames were lit, her eyes found mine once more. In that moment, I felt a wave of emotions that were not my own. Fear, sadness, but also a desperate hope. The scene before us began to shimmer and fade, the woman's anguished cries echoing in our ears as the mist enveloped us once more. As the spectral woman emerged from the mausoleum, her ethereal form seemed more solid than before. Her eyes, filled with centuries of sorrow, locked onto ours. When she spoke, her voice was a whisper on the wind, yet we heard it clearly. "You have seen the truth," she said. "You now carry the burden of my story." My father, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "We want to help," he said. "Tell us how." The ghost's form flickered, like a candle in a breeze. "My name was Elise," she began. "I was a healer, using the knowledge of plants and nature to cure ailments. But fear and ignorance turned my neighbors against me. They branded me a witch and took my life." As she spoke, the air around us seemed to thicken with emotion. I could feel her pain, her frustration, and her longing for justice. "All I ask is that my story be told," Elise continued, "that the truth of what happened here not be lost to time." My mother, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "We'll do more than that," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "We'll clear your name." The next morning, we found ourselves in the local library of the nearest town. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margot, looked at us curiously as we explained our interest in the area's history, particularly focusing on witch trials. "Ah," she said, her eyes lighting up. "You must have visited the old graveyard in the forest. Not many tourists find that place." As Margot led us through the stacks, pulling out dusty tomes and faded manuscripts, we began to piece together the history of the region. The 17th century had been a time of great upheaval, with superstition and fear running rampant. "There were several witch trials during that period," Margot explained, pointing to a particularly grim account. "But one case always stood out to me. A young woman named Elise, known for her healing abilities. The records show she was accused of witchcraft after a bad harvest and a bout of illness in the village. My father leaned in, his eyes scanning the ancient text. Does it say anything about the evidence against her? Margot shook her head. That's the curious thing. The records are frustratingly vague. It's as if someone wanted to obscure the details. As we delved deeper into the research, a pattern began to emerge. Elise had been popular among the common folk, her remedies often more effective than those of the official town physician. This had not sat well with some of the more powerful members of the community. Look at this, my mother said, pointing to a faded letter she had discovered. It's from the town physician to the magistrate. He's complaining about losing patients to a common hedge witch. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Elise hadn't been a witch at all, but a victim of jealousy and political maneuvering. Armed with our newfound knowledge, we approached the local historical society. At first they were skeptical of our claims, but as we presented the evidence we had uncovered, their interest grew. This could change our understanding of that entire period, the society's president, Dr. Fournier, said, as he pored over our notes. If what you're saying is true, Elise's case could be a key to re-examining other witch trials in the region. Over the next few days, our quiet family vacation turned into a full-fledged historical investigation. My parents threw themselves into the research, coordinating with Dr. Fournier and his team. I found myself acting as a bridge between the present and the past, my sensitivity to the supernatural providing insights that the historians might have otherwise missed. As word of our investigation spread, more people came forward with family stories and heirlooms. A descendant of the town's former magistrate provided a diary that corroborated our theories about the political motivations behind Elise's trial. The ghost of Elise herself seemed to gain strength as we uncovered more of the truth. Her appearances became more frequent, and each time she seemed more at peace. 2 weeks after our fateful hike in the woods, we stood once again in the old graveyard. But this time, we weren't alone. A crowd had gathered, historians, local officials, and curious townspeople. Dr. Fournier stood at the front, addressing the assembled group. Thanks to the tireless efforts of this family, he said, gesturing to us, we have uncovered a great injustice of our past. Elise was not a witch, but a healer, wrongly accused and convicted. Today, we set the record straight. As he spoke, a team began the work of restoring Elise's grave, which had been unmarked for centuries. A new headstone was placed, bearing her name and the truth of her story. As the ceremony concluded, I felt a familiar warmth beside me. Elise's spectral form appeared, more vibrant than ever before. Her face bore a smile of profound relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying on the wind. "You have freed me." With those words, her form began to fade, not into nothingness, but into a soft golden light that seemed to permeate the entire graveyard. As the light dissipated, I felt a sense of peace settle over the area, as if a great wrong had finally been righted. On our last night in Luxembourg, we sat around the campfire, reflecting on the extraordinary events of the past few weeks. What had started as a simple family vacation had turned into a life-changing adventure. "I never thought I'd be part of uncovering a historical injustice," my father mused, poking at the fire with a stick. My mother nodded, her eyes distant. "It makes you wonder how many other stories like Elise's are out there waiting to be told." As for me, I found myself grappling with my newfound understanding of my sensitivity to the supernatural. It wasn't a curse or something to be feared, but a gift that could bridge the gap between past and present, between the seen and unseen worlds. "What do we do now?" I asked, voicing the question that had been on all our minds. My parents exchanged a look. "Well," my father said slowly, "Dr. Fournier mentioned that there are similar cases in other parts of Europe. He suggested we might want to look into them." A thrill of excitement ran through me. The idea of more adventures, more mysteries to solve, more wrongs to right. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. "So this is just the beginning?" I asked, unable to keep the eagerness out of my voice. My mother smiled, reaching out to squeeze my hand. "If that's what you want, sweetheart, we could make it a family mission." As we sat there, planning our next adventure, I realized that our encounter with Elise had changed us all. We had set out to explore the world, but in the process, we had discovered a calling to be the voice for those long silenced by history. The morning of our departure dawned bright and clear. As we packed up our car, the weight of our experiences settled around us like a comfortable cloak. We were no longer just tourists, but guardians of forgotten truths. Before leaving, we made one last trip to the graveyard. Standing before Elise's restored headstone, we each took a moment to say our private goodbyes. As I placed my hand on the cool stone, I felt a gentle warmth, a final acknowledgement from Elise. As we drove away from Luxembourg, the road stretching out before us seemed to hold infinite possibilities. My father had already begun researching our next destination, a small town in the Black Forest of Germany with its own tales of misunderstood witches. Looking out the window at the passing landscape, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few short weeks. We had come to Luxembourg as a normal family on vacation, and were leaving as something else entirely: historians, investigators, and protectors of long-buried truths. The sun was high in the sky as we crossed the border into Germany. As the familiar excitement of a new adventure began to build, I realized that our true journey was just beginning. There were more stories to uncover, more wrongs to right, and more connections to be made between the past and the present. And as our car wound its way through the European countryside, I knew that wherever our path led us next, we would face it together. A family bound not just by blood, but by a shared mission to give voice to the voiceless and to shine a light on the shadows of history. Years have passed since that fateful summer in Luxembourg. What began as a chance encounter has blossomed into a lifelong pursuit. Our family has traveled across Europe, uncovering forgotten stories and bringing long-buried truths to light. Each case we investigate, each spirit we help to find peace, adds another thread to the rich tapestry of our shared history. We've learned that the past is never truly gone. It lives on in the stones of ancient buildings, in the whispers of the wind, and in the memories of those who have long since left this world. Our work has not always been easy. We've faced skepticism, opposition, and sometimes danger. But we've also found allies in the most unexpected places. Historians eager for new perspectives, local communities rediscovering their heritage, and even descendants of those involved in past injustices, seeking to make amends. As for me, my sensitivity to the supernatural has grown stronger with each passing year. I've learned to use it not just to communicate with spirits, but to read the emotional imprints left on places and objects. It's a gift that continues to guide us in our quest for truth. Tonight, as I write these words, we're camped at the edge of a forest in rural Romania. Tomorrow, we'll begin investigating reports of a shepherdess from the 18th century, wrongly accused of bringing a curse upon her village. Her story, like so many others, waits to be told. And so, our journey continues. With each story we uncover, each name we restore, we weave a connection between past and present, between the living and the dead. In doing so, we've discovered that history is not a fixed narrative, but a living, breathing entity that changes as we engage with it. As I close my journal and prepare for sleep, I can feel the whispers of the past swirling around our campsite. They no longer fill me with fear, but with a sense of purpose. For in listening to these long-silenced voices, in bringing their stories to light, we do more than correct historical records. We restore the humanity that was taken from them. And in this work, I found my calling. For as long as there are untold stories and unresolved injustices echoing through time, our family will be there, ready to listen, to understand, and to share these tales with the world. The end, or perhaps just another beginning.